I know a guy who dropped out of college to become a plumber. Not exactly the career path that gets you invited to fancy cocktail parties, right? But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. While his friends were buried under textbooks and student loans, he was already making solid cash. I mean, what's that about, right? Let me paint you a picture. Imagine it's a crisp autumn evening and you're at your high school reunion. You're catching up with everyone, and in walks Jake. Remember him? The guy who struggled with algebra and seemed more interested in video games than lectures. Yeah, Jake. Well, he's rolling up in a shiny new Tesla while your old study partner, who practically lived in the library, is stressed about their student loans and still figuring out life. Where's the justice in that? I used to think about this kind of stuff a lot. I mean, how does someone like Jake, who wasn't exactly destined for academic greatness, seem to navigate life with such ease and end up thriving? It used to drive me absolutely crazy. And here's the uncomfortable truth that I eventually stumbled upon. Being too smart might actually be holding you back. I know, that sounds ridiculous, but stick with me here. Hey, I'm Ben, and I probably spend way too much time pondering why some people seem to crack life's code while others, who seemingly did everything right, struggle. Today, I'm going to share some stories and insights that might completely change how you think about intelligence and success. Trust me, the research on this is absolutely mind-blowing. By the end of this video, you might actually find yourself reconsidering what it means to be successful and how you measure smarts. It's all about the stories that don't always get told, the ones about taking chances, staying adaptable, and sometimes just thinking outside the box. And before we dive into the nitty-gritty, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more content like this because I've got a feeling you'll want to stick around. So let's unravel why those seemingly not so smart individuals are cashing in faster than those of us who spent all night cramming for that calculus exam. Honestly, it's not the IQ points that count, but the EQ and the gutsy moves that often set the trajectory for success. So let's dive right into it with some data that might just blow your mind. Did you know that Swedish researchers followed nearly 60,000 men from adolescence to adulthood, tracking their cognitive scores and eventual financial outcomes? Yeah. And here's where it gets interesting. They found that those with average intelligence were just as likely to become wealthy as those who scored in the top percentiles. Shocking, right? Which brings us to our first reason why these not-so-smart folks often outpace the rest. They know how to take bold risks that lead to unimaginable success. Let me share a story about my friend Tom. Now, Tom was never what you'd call academically gifted. In fact, he barely scraped through high school, which always worried his parents. But Tom had this knack for seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. One day, and I'm serious about this, he bought a rundown ice cream truck on a whim. I remember thinking he'd lost his mind. I mean, who does that? But within 2 years, he wasn't just selling ice cream from that one truck. No, he had a fleet of them and was running his operation across 3 states. Honestly, it used to drive me absolutely crazy how effortlessly it seemed to come to him. Here's the thing that most of us don't want to admit. While we were busy playing it safe, Tom was taking these calculated risks that paid off big time. And here's a stat that might just make you rethink your approach. Research from the University of Cambridge suggests that entrepreneurs who take calculated risks are 30% more likely to succeed than those who play it safe. Let me repeat that because it's important. 30% more likely. This is where not overthinking becomes a strange advantage. The fear of failure that stops many of us dead in our tracks. Well, it's like Tom never got that memo. He saw a chance, jumped in with both feet, and figured out the logistics along the way. In real life, this might look like jumping on a business opportunity before it's fully fleshed out or buying into a burgeoning market before it hits mainstream. Think about it. In our everyday lives, how many times do we hold back because we're overanalyzing every little detail? We want everything to be perfect before we make a move. Meanwhile, people like Tom are out there making things happen, learning from the stumbles, and cashing in on opportunities that the rest of us missed because we were too busy overthinking. And this is where it gets even more interesting. The bold moves that seem reckless at first are often the ones that create the biggest waves. Fortune favors the bold, not the bookworms. So maybe it's time we learn to embrace a bit of that spontaneous spirit, try stepping outside our comfort zones, and see what bold risks we can take to propel us towards success. But risk-taking isn't the only factor. Sometimes it's about leveraging the power of simplicity. And that's what we'll delve into next. All right, so here's the second reason why those folks we consider not so smart seem to hit it big faster. And honestly, this might surprise you. Let me tell you about my friend Jake. Now, Jake barely got through high school math, and his attention span was like that of a goldfish. Not exactly a prodigy, but here's the thing. Jake had this childlike curiosity and simplicity in his ideas that I secretly envied. A few years back, Jake got this wild idea to start a mobile car wash service. I remember him telling me about it in the most casual way. I'll just drive around and wash cars. Easy, right? He didn't have a business plan, barely had any savings, and frankly, I thought he'd lost his marbles. Meanwhile, there I was, meticulously drafting a 30-page business proposal for a side gig I dreamt of starting. I had flowcharts, projections, and whatnot. What I didn't have was a single paying customer. Jake, on the other hand, just went for it. Within months, he was getting calls left and right, and his weekends were packed with appointments. And get this, after a year, he expanded to include a team of 3 and even started offering eco-friendly car washes. I remember watching him thrive and thinking, how on earth did he pull this off? The ironic part? While I was busy crafting the perfect strategy, Jake was already cashing in on a simple, straightforward idea. This pattern, my friends, happens everywhere, and it's honestly a little infuriating when you think about it. You see, while we're busy analyzing every little detail, worrying about the what-ifs, people like Jake are already knee-deep in making things happen. Here's the insight that hit me like a brick. Sometimes it's the stupid grit that wins. Jake's simplicity cut through the noise and got straight to the heart of what people wanted. He didn't overcomplicate things. He solved a common problem in the easiest way possible. What he lacked in academic smarts, he made up for with sheer action and adaptability. Now, I'm not saying you should make reckless decisions or skip the planning phase entirely, but there's something to be said about not letting perfection become the enemy of progress. The world doesn't always reward the most intellectual idea. It often rewards the one that simply gets the job done. So, next time you're on the verge of analysis paralysis, remember Jake's story. Sometimes keeping it simple and just starting can lead to the biggest payoffs, because at the end of the day, the world needs more doers, not just thinkers. And this is where our talk about persistence and adaptability comes into play. Let's dive into that next. All right, so here's the third reason why folks who you wouldn't peg as the brightest bulbs in the chandelier often surprise us with their financial success. And it's one that you might not have expected: their knack for persistence and adaptability. You remember when I mentioned my buddy who threw caution to the wind with a business plan while I was still dotting I's and crossing T's on mine? Let me fill you in on that story. We both had a mutual dream to start our own tech companies. I meticulously drafted a 50-page business plan. I carefully crafted every detail because that's what I was taught: plan, prepare, and then execute. Meanwhile, my friend, let's call him Kevin, just jumped right into it, armed with little more than a rough idea and sheer determination. Kevin's first app was honestly a mess. But here's where it gets interesting. He didn't stop. He didn't sit down to analyze every single misstep like I did. Nope, he pivoted faster than you could say iteration. He took the feedback, that's putting it kindly, and rolled it into something new. His willingness to adapt, to bend without breaking, led him to eventual success, while I was still staring at my beautifully crafted, utterly stagnant business plan. Here's a kicker that might blow your mind. A study by Stanford showed that entrepreneurs who are willing to pivot their strategies are 2.5 times more likely to succeed. Isn't that wild? It's not about having the perfect idea right out of the gate, but the ability to adjust and evolve as you go. So let's unpack this. What does it mean in practical terms? This adaptability is what positions these so-called not-so-smart folks to quickly respond to changes in the market. They're not bogged down by preconceived notions of having to be right all the time. It's like a game of chess where they're not necessarily thinking 10 moves ahead. Instead, they're reacting to the board as it changes, adapting their strategy in real time. Contrast that with the more intellectual types who often find themselves paralyzed by analysis. They get so caught up in needing all the answers before they act that they miss the window of opportunity. You might think that an ultra-smart individual would just breeze through, But in reality, they sometimes overvalue their own perspective, assuming the world operates on pure logic. But here's the thing, it doesn't. Humans are emotional beings, and success often goes to those who can ride the waves of change, rather than trying to resist or outsmart them. It's about staying in the game long enough, adapting as you learn, and picking up every piece of wisdom along the journey. So here's the real insight. In the race to riches, it's often the flexible, the persistent, the ones who have the guts to try, fail, and try again without letting their ego get in the way, who cross the finish line. It's not about having the highest IQ. It's about having the persistence and adaptability to navigate the unpredictable seas of entrepreneurship. And let me tell you, that kind of persistence is worth its weight in gold. All right, let's dive into this fourth reason. Our fourth reason gets right to the heart of the matter. Sometimes being labeled as the smart one can actually become a liability. Imagine you've been called a genius your whole life. There's this weight attached to that label, like you're constantly expected to deliver brilliance. When your identity is so tied to this image of perfection, there's a fear of making mistakes because honestly, every little slip up feels like it's screaming, "See, you're not as smart as everyone thinks." Meanwhile, I've noticed something interesting with folks who never had that kind of pressure. They weren't crowned the smartest kid in class or the next Einstein. Instead, their identity was never shackled to being the smartest or the best. The beautiful irony here is that they have absolutely nothing to prove. They're operating in a whole different arena where they have everything to gain. Imagine not having the fear of tarnishing a reputation you never had in the first place. It's freeing, really. Now, here's a concept I like to call the let them mentality. Instead of sweating over what others might think, you let them think whatever they want. You're not trying to maintain some intellectual facade. And it's this mindset that allows you to take chances you might otherwise shy away from if you were too concerned about looking foolish. Take this absurd example, the pet rock. It was nothing more than a smooth stone sold as a pet, complete with a cardboard box and some straw. At first glance, it sounds ridiculous. I mean, pet rocks? Who would buy that, right? But here's the thing, over 1 million people did. It turned into a multi-million-dollar business. The creator, Gary Dahl, wasn't afraid of being called silly. He just ran with the idea for the fun of it, and guess what? It paid off big time. Here's the pattern once you see it. While the traditionally smart people are tangled up worrying about what their professors or peers might think, the ones who've never been heralded as geniuses are out there embracing the unconventional ideas. They're the ones building businesses around what might seem like stupid concepts, because they aren't afraid of failure or looking dim-witted. Yeah. So if you're sitting there second-guessing yourself because your idea isn't smart enough, maybe it's time to adopt the let them mentality. Let people think what they want. It might just lead you to the kind of success that has everyone else scratching their heads in awe. All right, let's dive into the fifth and final reason why these so-called not-so-smart folks are raking in the riches faster than you'd expect. You see, they're not obsessed with prestige or looking smart, and that simple fact saves them a ton in both time and resources. Here's where things get interesting. Traditional smart people often chase prestige like it's the Holy Grail. I mean, who wouldn't want to have an Ivy League diploma hanging on their wall, right? But get this, the average annual tuition at those top schools is well over $60,000. Now imagine you're 18 years old, standing at a crossroads. On one path, you have the shiny allure of Harvard. On the other, there's the local state university or even a quirky, no-name startup opportunity. Now fast forward 20 years and ask yourself, who do you think is in better financial shape? The Ivy League graduate who's still chipping away at that mountain of debt, or the state school alum who started investing in real estate, or a quirky online business straight out of college? The math isn't even close once you factor in the compound interest on student loans versus early investments. Let me tell you about a friend of mine, Josh. He never set foot in a college classroom. Instead, he started a landscaping business right out of high school. Now, landscaping might not get you invites to swanky dinners, but Josh doesn't care. He's too busy depositing checks and planning his next holiday. While his classmates are worrying about their next performance review, Josh is expanding his business into neighboring towns. It's a classic case of focusing on what really works instead of what's supposed to look good. And here's the crucial difference. While the traditionally smart crowd gets ensnared by the expectations of prestige, The so-called average folks focus on practical moves that pay off. They're not playing by the same rules. They're out there playing a completely different game, one where the goal is financial freedom, not social validation. Not exactly the career path that gets you invited to fancy cocktail parties, right? But here's the thing. Josh is laughing all the way to the bank. And as he adds another zero to his savings account, the prestige seekers are still trying to figure out how to best leverage their degrees. So there you have it. It's not always the ones with the highest IQ or the fanciest degrees who win the financial game. In the real world, it's often the practical, the fearless, and those least concerned with appearances who end up on top. So here's what's really wild about all this. The traits that make these not so smart folks successful aren't some intricate mysteries only decoded by geniuses. Nope, they're things like persistence, emotional intelligence, willingness to take risks, and a knack for simple but effective ideas. These are the real keys to the kingdom, my friend. But here's the catch. If you've been told your whole life that you're smart and destined for greatness, it can actually be harder to develop these traits. Why? Because you might be too busy striving for perfection, too afraid of making mistakes, or too focused on flaunting intellectual prowess. Meanwhile, those who were underestimated, they've been rolling up their sleeves, taking practical steps, and aren't worried about looking foolish. That's their hidden advantage. The liberating truth here is that success isn't an exclusive club for the academic elite. It's available to pretty much anyone willing to put in the work, take some risks, and learn from the bumps in the road. You don't need to be born with a sky-high IQ. You just need to develop the right habits and be ready to seize the moment. So why not start taking action instead of getting stuck in analysis paralysis? Focus on building relationships, not just cramming knowledge. And don't be afraid to look a little silly if it means you might learn something invaluable. Maybe it's time to embrace the so-called average and start getting rich. It's a different game, and you can start playing it right now.